Ho, ho, ho!
Vitajte pri novej epizóde Kvás rádia.
Tak ako každý týždeň, aj teraz máme pre vás pripravenú novú zaujímavú tému.
Tak neváhajte, nasadte si slúchadlá a prajme vám príjemné počúvanie.
In the past, we would find it strange and kind of sci-fi if we saw somebody wearing a surgical mask outside the hospital operating room. And if somebody would tell us that in a couple of years we will be doing the same thing as our fellows living in big Asian cities, we would probably laugh. Now, with the coronavirus, we are getting used to face masks being part of our day-to-day attire. That's why we are going to research more about the origins of them in this episode. We can start in the 1st century AD, in the early Roman Empire. The Romans mined for metals in every part of their empire. Gold signified wealth, prosperity, and the social status of an individual. Since it was considered the metal of the gods and was believed to have descended from the sun, it was widely used for making ornaments. Weapons were mostly manufactured out of iron, though sometimes bronze was used instead. The Roman author, naturalist, army commander, and a great friend of the emperor Vespasian, Pliny the Elder, wrote Naturalis Historia, or Natural History, which became an editorial model for encyclopedias. He described how miners would use some sort of face mask made with animal bladders to protect themselves from the toxins in the mines. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, the wise Leonardo da Vinci recommended using wet cloths over the mouth and nose to avoid contagious infections.
The oldest and perhaps best known face masks that are preserved to this day were made in the 17th century when the European struggle known as Black Death came back after 300 years and caused millions of deaths. This type of mask, with eccentric shape of a bird's beak, was designed to protect its wearer from the foul odors associated with the plague. Usually, it was filled with aromatic plants and herbs. It also included glass lenses to protect the eyes. The general attire of doctors at that time included not only the masks, but also leather gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, a long leather coat, and a rod which enabled them to examine patients without getting too close. Although these creepy suits were commonly used, they did not specifically prevent to spread the disease, which was transmitted by fleas, not by the infected patients as it was believed. The mask itself then somehow fell into oblivion, but sooner or later it got its time to shine again. At the end of the 19th century, a prominent German biologist, Karl Fluge, developed the droplet theory of infection. It revolved around the idea that microorganisms in droplets expelled from the respiratory tract are a means of transmission. That same year, a Polish surgeon proposed that one layer of gauze could serve as a surgical mask. We also have to mention Dr. Alice Hamilton, who claimed that masks should be worn by nurses handling sterile dressings and doctors during operations to prevent droplet infections from spreading from doctors to the patients.
However, it was not until 1910 that masks started to be worn in hospitals. Part of the reason why they started to be used was another epidemic. The Manchurian plague started in northeastern China, as the disease name suggests. mortality rate almost 100% stimulated a multinational medical response, and the wearing of the first personal protective equipment. It was believed that the disease was transmitted through the bites of infected fleas, until a young doctor named Tech convinced his colleagues that it was also transmitted through the air. He also promoted quarantine, and the medical staff started to cover their heads with bandages or hold fabric over their noses and mouth while transporting the bodies of people who died due to this plague. The Chinese government also sought the support of foreign doctors, a number of whom died as a consequence of the disease. The Frenchman Gérald Messny, who disputed Wu's recommendation of masks, died catching the plague when visiting patients without wearing one. Tech also convened the International Plague Conference in Shenyang, then called Mukden, in April 1911 to debate the epidemiological and public health aspects of the outbreak. It was the first major event of its kind that brought together an international team of scientists concerned with disease control.
Also thought of a harness system that could hold the fabric on the person's face, allowing freedom of movement. The demand for this product was enormous and everyone started to use it in the streets. The use of face masks in the West would explode not even after a decade later with the outbreak of the Spanish flu. And many masks were homemade with the use of gas, adhesive tape and other materials. After the World War I, multiple experiments were conducted. Doctors tested 3 types of masks: coarse gauze, medium gauze and a buttercloth. They concluded that the coarse gauze was ineffective and that thinner gauze provided better results in terms of preventing the transmissions of microorganisms. Photos took during this time indicate that by 1923, over 2/3 of medical personnel wore masks. With the advent of antibiotics in the early 1940s, attention to surgical masks decreased dramatically. There were almost no publications or improvement about them. However, people started realizing that antibiotics were not a replacement of sterile techniques. A part of the reason was also the Second World War and the air pollution it brought. Particularly in London, people were forced to wear face masks because of smoke. They were called smog masks. They soon became a symbol of social courtesy.
In the 1950s, the first mask that combined the properties of filtration and deflection was designed. It was more efficient in comparison with the previously used gauze mask. The industrial production and further research and development of reusable masks was largely halted with the transition towards disposable masks in the 1960s. There were advertisements for new kinds of filtering masks made of non-woven synthetic fibers. These were all disposable. Their performance, comfort, and convenience highlighted their production. The only con was that they could be used only once, because their synthetic fabric would deteriorate during sterilization. This was a part of the broader transformation in hospital care towards what Life magazine enthusiastically named throwaway living, that included syringes, needles, trays, and almost all surgical instruments. Medicine has been transformed by consumer culture. Disposability was supposed to reduce the risk of compromising the precarious state of sterility. Another reason for this transition was the desire to reduce labor costs and to respond to the increased demand.
In the 1975, there was conducted a study in which the authors concluded that the reusable mask made of 4-ply cotton was superior to the popular disposable paper mask and the new synthetic respirator. Some studies have even suggested that washing reusable mask might increase its bacterial filtering efficiency, perhaps by tightening their fibers. On the other hand, there were studies that compared the disposables with the quite inefficient homemade gauze ones. Results from these studies reinforced the false idea that reusable mask was potentially unsafe, discouraging further research into well-designed and industrially manufactured reusable masks. What is definite though, disposable masks and respirators will certainly remain an essential part of medical protective equipment in the future, since they possess specific filtration qualities designed for healthcare situations.
But we should still look beyond the creation of large stockpiles of disposable face masks and consider the risk of the throwaway consumer culture. Perhaps one day we might be able to say what medical researchers wrote in 1918. A mask may be repeatedly washed and used indefinitely. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake happened in Japan. It was very similar to the last century's Great Kanto earthquake, but with the technical progress that humanity made over the past 100 years, it brought much more damage. Firestorm that followed damaged the Fukushima reactors that leaked radiation and left the sky filled with residual ash for months. Face mask production surged, and it became an essential accessory for the inhabitants of Tokyo and Yokohama. Over time, face masks have also become a symbol for some protests, such as the Hong Kong protests, and were even popularized among some rap and K-pop singers.
Face masks, a simple accessory that offers protection against coronavirus, has been prescribed by global health authorities as an important tool to fight the current pandemic. They represent an act of solidarity, displaying that the world's citizens are on the same board with the preventive measures needed to control COVID-19 contagion. Thank you for your attention. This was Sára and Jozef Jelšík and the history of face masks.
Ďakujeme za vypočutie. Ak sa vám epizóda páčila,
neváhajte nám napísať na náš Instagram @BuzzRadio alebo zanechať 5-hviezdičkové hodnotenie.
Dúfame, že si nás naladíte aj na budúce.
Tento podcast bol vytvorený v jedinečnej spolupráci s učami alumni a týmu BuzzRadio. Založené v roku 2020 Jakubom Abrahamom